Hello everybody, it's me again. So now this is the second lecture for today dealing with Richard Epstein and his readings, his book Takings, a summary of which you could read in the article that I posted in files. What I posted as well was a review, like a critical review of the book that you can find now also in files, and the review is useful because the reading is slightly difficult and Epstein's writing style is not easy to make sense of. So the book review can help you also to make some general sense of what is going on. This is the book about which we're talking about, Takings, published in 1985. And creating a firestorm of controversy at that time. The book was extremely controversial and still is extremely controversial because it argues that a large part of what the modern government, federal government, is doing is unconstitutional. And it bases the assessment of the unconstitutionality of a large part of what the federal government does on an analysis of a single provision of the American Constitution, and that is the Takings Clause, the so-called Takings Clause of the Fifth Amendment, that says no private property shall be appropriated for public use, or shall be taken for private use, hence the Takings Clause. No private property shall be taken for public use without just compensation. That's so-called eminent domain clause or takings clause. So what Epstein argues is that the scope of this eminent domain clause, takings clause, is very broad. If you interpret it correctly within the context of the American constitutional structure, you will realize that it invalidates 80 or 90% of what modern federal government does, especially in the areas of regulation of business, taxation, price controls, zoning laws, and so on. So a large part of tax and spend and regulatory policies are unconstitutional because they represent takings of private property without just compensation. So that's the key. The difference, the reason why this book was so controversial is that the usual interpretation of the takings clause is very narrow. That it concerns itself only with a narrow scope of takings for infrastructure projects. Somebody confiscates the private land in order to build a highway or an airport and so on. So then the standard of just compensation here kicks in, and the debate is what can government do and what is the standard for just compensation and so on. So that's a narrow interpretation of the scope of takings clause that Epstein says is based on the misunderstanding of the original meaning of the Constitution. So what he says is that this clause should be applied much broader so as to cover regulation, taxation, and a broad swath of economic policy done by the federal government. So this theory is predicated on a certain understanding of the legitimate scope of government and certain definition of its legitimate scope and a redefinition of the meaning of some of the key terms, starting with takings and with just compensation and public use as well. So what Epstein says is that takings, number one, is not just confiscating private land for public use. It's also taking private property in the forms of taxation. It's also regulating or limiting your ability to use your private property by various kinds of regulations, such as minimum wage law is a taking because it prevents the consenting adults from exchanging their private property in a certain way that will benefit them. It reduces economic benefits from using the private property. So that's also a form of taking. Zoning laws that prevent people from building houses in certain areas are also forms of taking, or regulations of prices, rent controls. Rent control ordinances or regulations reduce the value of property that people have artificially and thereby represent a form of taking of private property. So that's the gist of Epstein's argument, that there is no theoretical difference, there is no doctrinal or constitutional difference between the government coming to your house and stealing something from you or confiscating your land in order to build a highway, and government coming at you and erecting arbitrary regulations or arbitrary taxation in order to achieve goals that the government wants and you may not want. Both forms of exchange, forced exchange, constitute what the Constitution defines as taking. So now the same rules that apply to narrowly defined takings should be applied then to taxation and regulation. So the upshot of the analysis is that forced transfers without compensation to people from whom you take money are based on coercion, uncompensated coercion, and are unconstitutional. So essentially, the New Deal federal government that enacted Social Security and the post laws and all kinds of other government regulations and redistributive programs, and the post-New Deal government, so with Medicare, Medicaid, and the entire panoply of federal welfare state is strictly speaking unconstitutional, in virtue of running against the proper understanding of the takings clause. So essentially, by doing these things, the federal government is taking private property away without compensating people from whom it is taking it. So one example of that would be progressive taxation. So progressive taxation is a law that promises equal benefits to everybody, equal benefits of protection, police protection, military protection, legal services of the courts, and so on, all kinds of stuff that the government is producing, but then taxes unevenly all people. Imposes 10% on me, 25% on you. So there is this disproportionate impact or disproportionate burden between different people, and people who pay higher rate of taxation only in virtue of their higher income are not compensated for their disproportionate contribution to this. So according to Epstein, this is unconstitutional because it represents a taking of this additional amount of money that's above the amount that the person would have paid under the proportionately apportioned taxes. Like flat taxes are only consistent with legitimate government. Anything beyond that is a form of taking. So we have to distinguish, and Epstein distinguishes here between legitimate government and illegitimate government. The story of two pies at the beginning, that the inner pie, the inner scope of voluntary activity is something that doesn't need government, when people can negotiate their contracts and exchange goods and services with little or no government involvement. But there are certain things that require collective action, as he says, that requires government in order to solve the problems, like the judiciary, like military and police. Then we need the government coercion. And then We need taxes and government spending and social transfers from consumers, from citizens to the government in order to fulfill these services. But the important difference is that these things could be apportioned, or the costs should be borne equally by everybody. That everybody should be, if somebody is disproportionately affected by this, they should be compensated by the states. So he says on page 10, in the second paragraph that is underlined here. Is there anyone who seriously argues today that these systems are not ways, regulatory and tax systems, to effectuate wealth transfers between interest groups and hence between individuals? Why then the reluctance to apply the prohibition against uncompensated takings to this entire class of social transfers? So you see this idea that takings clause in traditional jurisprudential understanding by the Supreme Court is that you cannot take my land without just compensation for public use. And he says, just if you apply this to all other takings, regulatory and tax takings, you will have to compensate people for these as well. Why then the reluctance to apply the prohibition to this entire class of social transfers? If A takes 10 from X and B takes 10 from Y, and so on down the line, what difference does it make if we call it a set of takings, a special assessment, or a tax? Again, the distinction is deplored, but no categorical demarcation between takings and taxes is offered. All regulations, all taxes, and all modifications of liability rules are takings of private property prima facie compensable by the state. So you see now this is this broadening of the application of the burden to compensate that the Fifth Amendment takings clause imposes on the federal government from narrowly defined infrastructure projects. Like there's one example, the eminent domain complaint in 2011, I believe, and the New York versus, I've forgotten what was the title of the case, it escapes me right now, but the woman didn't want to sell her house and they confiscated her house and paid her some compensation. So that was a taking of private property for public use, but this was just this was consistent with the narrowly defined traditional eminent domain laws, takings of private property, a house in this particular case, for a public project. Now, the controversy here was because the project they were taking private property for was not a public project in the traditional sense, like a highway or a bridge or a railway system that the government usually does, but it was for private shopping mall. So that was one of the abominations of this case, that actually it was a taking of private property for private benefit of other people. But even then, it was a narrowly tailored for a given project that was being built at the time. But you have the same kind of dynamic or the same kind of forced transaction when the government forces you to do something with compensation, of course. Government forces you to do certain things, to relinquish your private property, but does not compensate you at all. So I'm paying progressive taxes. Let's say I'm a millionaire, I pay 35% of your income. Your income is $50,000 per year. You pay very little in the way of income taxes. We receive the same services from the government. I'm not compensated in any shape or form for my disproportionate contribution to that. Or, for example, the local government is regulating the building codes and zoning regulations in such a way as to disfavor people who would want to build their houses right now. This regulation actually devalues the value of their property and makes them worse off, while benefiting the already people who already built their houses. The unwanted newcomers are not compensated for this taking of their private property indirectly from their ability to invest their private property in any way or form that they want to do. So this is the idea of compensation for regulatory and tax takings that are not accepted by modern constitutional jurisprudence. So if Epstein was to be taken seriously, if Epstein's theory is to be accepted, then a large part of what modern governments, both state and federal governments, do would have been considered unconstitutional. So see on the page 9, this underlined quotation is interesting because he demonstrates how and why exactly the zoning law is to be considered unconstitutional. He says the number of takers and the number of victims does not change the quality of the act. The network of covenants still restricts use. It is a nice convention of language, but one of no moral consequence. To call the single act by A against X a taking, while we call the acts of A, B, and C collectively against X, Y, and Z collectively zoning. So you see, people enact the zoning law and prevent somebody from building a house. So that's okay, that's a zoning law. But if I forbid you by using the force, illegal force to build a house in my neighborhood, that's an act of coercion and unacceptable. So what is his target here is the majoritarian democracy overstepping its bounds, using the democratic majorities to clamp down on individual rights and private property rights of individuals living in that society. So what he wants to say is that we cannot have it both ways here. If we define certain kinds of actions, like artificially coercively restricting people from doing certain things, or stealing private property, or forcibly preventing people from doing certain things that do not harm anyone else by individuals, we cannot approve of them when the governments do them, when democratic majorities do them. So that's the basic idea, that the American Constitution was meant to prevent this majoritarian mistreatment or majoritarian abuse of power to limit the individual rights of the citizens. So then we have to construct a government in such a way as to limit its own ability to go beyond the minimal functions of protecting private property and providing the basic framework for society to survive. So then that's the only allowed form of redistribution of wealth is the one that is used to keep and maintain the coercive apparatus of government maintaining order. That's the only allowed form of redistribution of wealth. And it has to be done in a symmetrical and coherent fashion, which means that every single individual has to bear an equal burden of financing the government, which means, in theory and in practice, proportionate taxation or flat taxes. So he says in the next passage here, the takings are a function of two variables: the number of persons from whom something is taken, and the fraction or percentage of what is taken from each person P. The analytical point is that T taking remains a taking for all values of n from 1 to infinity, however many people we are taking from, and for all values of P between 0 and 1, between 0 and 100%. That means it doesn't matter whether we are taking 5% more from 0.01% of people, like billionaires. So let's say wealth taxes, that's a good example that Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders will impose. Wealth taxes are directly unconstitutional, according to Epstein. Why? Because the number of people is small, and the percentage of value is also small, maybe 0.1, but that doesn't change the fact that taking is still is present. It's simply just an exaction, it's just a plunder. It's a legal plunder, as one French economist, Frédéric Bastiat, would say, to take someone's private property without just compensation. So the billionaires would be compensated for the taking of their private property here. So see what Epstein wants to do here. He wants to infuse the discussion of economic regulations and taxes and economic life with a moral and legalistic language. To say that you cannot do certain things because you are running against certain moral and constitutional principles. So there is a place for economic efficiency here, but also the main reason why these things are not allowed is moral and legal. It's a taking. It embodies this American idea that taxation is theft. Essentially, that's what Epstein's idea boils down to. Taxation is theft, and regulation is theft if the victims are not equally compensated. This just compensation and equal burden, that's the key. That's a key component of the just government. So everything that could be taken only for public use. That's the first element. Only for public use. That means only to build infrastructure, military, police, judicial system, and stuff that we cannot fix ourselves within the private economy. So that's the first component of this takings philosophy by Richard Epstein. Only transfers of wealth for public purposes of maintaining the machinery of government that protects us, that's legitimate. Anything beyond that is illegitimate. And the second component, any kind of redistribution of wealth should be compensated. Individuals should be compensated for it. Which means that you can arbitrarily tax somebody beyond the level of anybody else only if you offer to these persons disproportionate benefits from taxation. So it's not unimaginable. So Epstein is not an absolutist who's saying, no, all taxation is theft and you can never tax progressively anyone. No, what he wants to say is that, yes, you can arbitrarily tax, you can tax some people more than others, but that cannot be arbitrary, only because you want to do it. You have to offer them benefits, the level of benefits that are proportionate to the burdens that they bear. So the only way how you can tax billionaires 20% more is to offer them 20% more benefits of government services. If you're not offering them that, you cannot tax them more. So that's then your taxation is taken. Just simply is the same from the moral, legal, and constitutional point of view, has the same effect as stealing and theft. That's the gist. That's the gist of the argument. So redistribution of wealth has to be wealth neutral, which means that nobody has to be. So everybody has to pay something. So Epstein is not an anarchist. He says we need the government for these narrowly defined purposes, but everything that people pay has to make them has to make the benefits that they receive commensurate to the burdens that they bear. It's not allowed that you disproportionately share this burden. And the only criterion that he accepts is the criterion of proportionate taxation. So you see the point that I made on page 10, this underlined portion says that the Constitution is not a suicide pact, which means that we need the government and we need the taxes and we need the government spending. So I'm not an anarchist. but an effort to find a limited government solution to the Hobbesian fear of unbridled self-interest. So it's an effort to go out of this Hobbesian jungle in which everybody is at war with everybody else, but in the same time to find a way in such to find this equilibrium in such a way as to not to fall prey to structural weaknesses of pure representative democracy. He says in one chapter in Takings to find the Lockean solution for the Hobbesian problem. So that's what is the Lockean solution for the Hobbesian problem. There's this idea of limited government that equally and justly treats everybody and that limits itself, and that is not given to these abuses of majoritarian democracy to clamp down on individual rights. So the function of the constitution is to secure individual rights while limiting the power of the majority. So see, then he finds certain exceptions and certain kind of limitations to this rule of against takings. But he says what is important to bear in mind that these limitations apply both to private individuals and to governments. So it's eminent domain clause and other limitations. So it says there is no magic transformation of what constitutes a tort. So you know what are torts. As we move from the individual to the collective case. So two, there is no magical expansion of the types of justifications that can be offered at the group level. Building an ordinary home does not become a nuisance against many neighbors when it is not a nuisance against any of them individually. So see, in order to make something a nuisance, for example, to prohibit somebody from doing something, which is possible in theory, which is if I sue you and I prove before the common law court that you are making nuisance, that I was here first and then you came along and then you are polluting with your factory, or you are making other tort infringements on me, they may forbid you from doing so. They may order you to close down the shop or to pay me the multiple damages and so on. But the key component here, or the key argument here, is that the same common law restrictions have to apply to the government. The government cannot just say, oh, this is nuisance, I don't like this, I'm going to prohibit this activity because I think that's not in public interest. No, the same logic of private common law has to apply to public law as well. So that's one of the crucial arguments that Epstein develops. That the government in its coercive activity has to be driven and controlled by the same rules of the legal game that individual actors before common law courts are driven and controlled. The law of nuisance and all other kinds of laws that are used, that could be used theoretically and in practice by individuals to sue and restrain the behavior of other people, have to apply to the governments at all. So this is called the police power. This right to limit your use of private property rights in the name of reducing nuisance or third-party effects. Okay, so that's called police power, and it exists in private common law, and it also can exist when the government employs. And then he says, the invocation of police power to justify most varieties of modern zoning laws therefore fails because the end of government action is impermissible. So that's government appropriates for itself a kind of authority to restrict certain activities that no other individual has for himself or herself. So this is one of the crucial points, that all rules all limitations, all rights, and all obligations that individuals have if they want to limit the use of private property by other people have to apply to the government, have to limit the government's authority as well. So, needless to say that this is not the case in current constitutional jurisprudence, that governments now do essentially whatever they want. So the Supreme Court is largely acquiescing in any kind of economic. It's enough that the government says it's a use of police power and the government commerce clause jurisprudence, and we want to regulate certain aspect of commerce. The Supreme Court throws its hands and says it's fine, it's okay. We're not gonna strike it down. So he says that's illegitimate. The courts should be in business in reviewing and restraining and limiting and adjudicating meticulously the government's decisions about economic regulation in the same way they meticulously adjudicate the private actions, private torts, lawsuits, and other ways in which individuals can try and restrain the economic activities and uses of private property by other individuals. So he then develops a variety of different tests, different legal doctrines, how this could be done, how we can put in practice this idea. And some of them are widely used, the standards of disparate effect. So the judges should be then studying whether a particular measure will have a discriminatory effect to some individuals. And then if this is established to be the case, then the law should be stricken down as taking without compensation. So a certain law has a highly asymmetric effects to the parties involved. So for example, a certain kind of labor contracts that are going to benefit one party over the other, then the government cannot impose this regulation if it could be proven that it will have grossly unequal effects to the different groups. Or, for example, if it's been proven that a certain regulation was passed as a consequence of lobbying and special privileges capturing the government and using it for the purposes of enacting laws that will benefit themselves. So that's a plunder, that's a taking of private property of all of us for the purposes of enriching our narrow corporate elite, for example. So some of the tariffs would be certainly unconstitutional because they're kind of conspiracy between the government and the wealthy manufacturing elites to rip off the consumer in exchange for producing domestic steel, domestic aluminum, and so on. So this is called the rent-seeking test. This idea whether the laws were enacted and devised in such a way as to benefit one group at the expense of other groups. So not only that the effects are disproportionate, but also that they are explicitly designed to benefit one group at the expense of the other. So that's another test that the courts should be using according to Epstein. So this is also something that has been controversial not only among the big government proponents, but also among some libertarians, because it was not clear how these tests and how this economically informed legal reasoning would unfold in practice. And Epstein is well aware of these effects, and he says at one point towards the end of the article, he says that I'm not saying that this is going to be easy, but it's less bad than simply to give a blank check to the government and say you can do whatever you want as long as you're capable of reciting certain public interest rationale or whatever. He says what governments do in the absence of these kinds of restrictions, they simply just recite public interest, common good, public welfare, and then enact any number of special interest legislative pieces that benefit one group at the expense of a wider society. That's how the legislative process works in practice, as opposed to the textbooks of political science. But he says, oh yeah, there is certain gray area here and room for misunderstanding and room for interpretation, but it's a far better solution than just to give up and allow governments to do whatever they want. So okay, so this is just my basic summary of the Epstein's piece. I will post. I already posted Demzit's lecture on Canvas, and I will post now Epstein and the reading that I told you about as well. So I will also very soon set up the assignments for your final exams and for your papers. So keep informing me about the progress in your preparations for the exam, and especially in your work on your paper. So if you have any further questions, a couple of you sent me your questions and queries, and I tried to help as much as I could. So if you have any further questions or you're in need of any further help, please don't hesitate to contact me as soon as possible. So stay healthy, stay safe, and good luck in your work.